Welcome to the next installment in my video lecture series for macroeconomics. And in this particular video lecture, we're going to take a look at the ASAD model. And we're going to take a look in particular how changes in aggregate demand will look for different portions of the aggregate supply curve. So we're going to take a look at when aggregate demand is stimulated in a flatter portion of the aggregate supply curve. And then also if we do a similar type of stimulus where the aggregate supply curve is more vertical. And what we're going to do is compare how that stimulus impacts prices and income for those two particular areas. So here we have our aggregate supply curve, all right, and this vertical section here corresponds to the full employment output level. So here's our original price level and our original output level. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a stimulus to the economy, whether it be a decrease in taxes, an increase in government spending, whatever. And we want to see what is the impact on prices and output when we're in the flatter portion of the aggregate supply curve. So here we have the aggregate demand curve shifting to the right. And as you can see there, I changed it to aggregate demand 1 to show that's a different aggregate demand curve. And you can see when we stimulate the economy in the flatter portion of aggregate supply, we can see that there's a dramatic increase in income and output. So we go from Y0 to Y1, and a very small increase in the price level. So you can see that when we stimulate the economy in the flatter portion of aggregate supply, the majority of the impact is going to be on output/income and some impact on prices. Now let's compare that if we continue stimulating aggregate demand, but now we're in the more vertical section to see what happens. So we're going to have a further shift of aggregate demand, and we are going to see what occurs there. Well, you can see we moved from Y1 to Y2, so it had a very limited impact on output and income, but a much more dramatic impact on the price level. So I want you to be aware of that if we stimulate the economy, it depends on where we are on the aggregate supply curve. If we're in the flatter portion of the aggregate supply curve and we stimulate aggregate demand, we get a very large, or we get a large increase in income relative to the increase in the price level. So we'll still have some inflationary pressures, but a majority of the stimulus is going to cause an increase in output and aggregate output and aggregate income. If we are stimulating the economy in the section where we're more vertical with aggregate supply, you can see what the net impact is. We have a similar shift in aggregate demand from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, and we have a much smaller increase in aggregate output and income, and a much larger increase in the price level. It's much more inflationary. Now the explanation for this, so if we're in this portion here, we're at aggregate demand 1, that if we're in the flatter portion of the aggregate supply curve, there's a couple of things that are occurring. The economy is not producing at full employment output. So therefore, resources are being underutilized, which means that workers are being underutilized, plant, capital, and machinery are being underutilized. So when we stimulate the economy in this portion, we're not going to see a dramatic increase in prices because there are so many idle resources. So we're not really going to push wage rates up that much higher because we might have large-scale unemployment in the economy. Have a lot of people out of work and looking for work, and they'll be, I don't want to say grateful, but they will be willing to work because they've been out of work for so long, so there won't be upwards pressure on wages because of the stimulus in aggregate demand. Also, there won't be any increase in input prices. So if people are buying raw materials, etc., there's a surplus of raw materials out there, so an increase in aggregate demand will not push those prices up. Also, firms won't be building new plant or buying new capital and new machinery because there are already a pre-existing plant, capital, and machinery that are lying idle. So that is the explanation for why this stimulus is not very inflationary while it is increasing aggregate output and income during the same, because of the same stimulus. On the other hand, when we move from aggregate demand curve 1 to aggregate demand curve 2, we're getting closer and closer to the full employment output level. And then we actually get to the full employment output level. So what you see here is that there is going to be more pressure on prices because we are getting to the full employment output level. Unemployment is not such a big problem. So in order to induce more people to work, wage rates are going to have to go up. And as aggregate demand increases, the input costs are going to increase. And also the fact that companies might have to build new plants, buy new capital, buy new machinery, which will also put upwards pressure on those prices. So that's why when we go from aggregate demand curve 1 to aggregate demand curve 2, we see a small increase in aggregate output / income, but we see a dramatic increase in the price level.